But you're an architect.
Yeah, I'm an architect, and yeah, I'm a member of the Architecture Collective Assemble, so we do architecture together. But we've also, I think, quite a lot of us, including myself, have taught architecture in various institutions, so have some limited understanding of academia, although through the very strange lens of architectural education, which is quite specific and quite a kind of odd sort of halfway house between a kind of technical education and a kind of humanities education.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think we should just launch right into this. I mean, my guess is that, the humanities are they're really under threat. I think this is quite visible. On the one hand, I see a strategy which is a sort of old classic kind of Oxbridge strategy, which seems to be, and I think quite a lot of our present government subscribe to this, which is that the humanities are a kind of useful decorative subject for wives, perhaps. These are attitudes that I'm not affirming, I'm just commenting. And it seems to me that there are quite a lot of people making policy in this area now that think that humanities are perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly all right for people to know how to quote Euripides every now and then, but mostly they're not a useful thing to do. And then in instrumentalizing economy, what you want is to shrink the humanities back into the old high university form, which educates decorative people so they make better conversations and perhaps go off and become lawyers and use their skills in that way. Perhaps a few become architects as well. So that's one position which seems to be resurgent, although since I was at university, at a new university in Canterbury, in the early 70s, we already thought that argument was over, but it seems to be quite strong. The other, I suppose, is that, we've got value for money coming in. And the humanities, I mean, we've always been seen as, I guess in a sense, when you don't come out, when you're not charging, nearly £10,000 a year in fees, you don't have to do that calculation. So, I remember the humanities as a sort of place where you went to get your mind together. Place where you went to sort of figure out some stuff about the culture you were in and perhaps pick up a perspective you could take forward in lots of different ways. But that too seems to be no longer tolerable to the powers that be or the people who are making decisions at the moment. But it does seem to me that the humanities as a kind of place for critical reflection are absolutely invaluable. And having taught in polytechnics, ex-polytechnics, and lastly, even in a quite respectable, formerly University of London university, I've seen it at all levels. I've seen students come in and transform themselves into people who can then proceed to reinvent themselves in many different fields. So, I feel very defensive of that possibility, but it entails a kind of non-instrumental perspective for sure. You have to be there. You have to find moments when you're there where you're not just worrying about the fees and what you're going to do.
And how do we feel about the relationship between, I guess, the teaching of humanities and teaching of the arts specifically? So I guess like the art school as a model, because it feels like they're not, I don't know if they're the same, but they feel like they have similar, some of the things you just said could be related to the art school, which I guess is somewhere that I'm maybe more familiar with as an institution, and the art school as a place where people go to learn how to think and to be, to be people in the world as much.
Yeah. I think it does. When I was a student in Canterbury, I was at this brand new university. I'm not saying the past is where the answers are, but we were at these new universities, post-Robbins universities, that were going to change things. They were going to be interdisciplinary. They were going to broaden the horizon. They were going to connect to cultural practice outside the academy. They weren't thinking all their students were going to be lecturers in the next department. That awful thing you see in quite a lot of old literature departments, that the only goal is to go and do a PhD in Henry James or whatever. So they weren't like that. But I also shared a house with people who were at the art college. And at that time, it was very interesting to see because there were incompetence in the old art colleges. There were a lot of paid up lecturers who seemed to disappear to the pub at about 11 o'clock and not come back in until the next teaching day. But this opened up space for at Canterbury. We had people like Ian Dury. We had lots of people who came in on the part-time sessional basis, who really did the teaching and turned the place into a proper laboratory. So I think with the art schools, I mean, you're quite right that there is that link with practice. I think also that, there's a sense of making, which I certainly learned a lot from that with the people I knew who were doing those art school courses. And I think that writing is best thought of as a kind of making, since I've done a lot of it. I mean, you are basically a maker. You're not actually simply an intellectual person with ideas. You're somebody who's trying to put a thing together out of words. So you're making buildings in a way too. So I think that link with making is actually more important in a broader range of humanities perhaps than arts college and architecture. I also like the fact that, I mean, I used to do things at the Architecture Association in London for a while. And I remember there was that wonderful period in the AA where they sort of decided all the briefs you were going to get in the real world were so bad and so compromising that, the clients were so sort of dismal in their expectations that you had to sort of withdraw architecture from engagement with the world at all. And the whole place became a sort of notional thing where they decided that they would practice designing, I don't know, a house for some ancient Greek or Pliny, or they would do, I remember one scheme was to do a house for Derek Jarman on the Dorset coast, and there was another. I mean, and I think I've always liked the way the Architecture Association pulled back into those moments of, sort of separation from what is practically possible in order to renew a sense of what architecture might be. And all these things would not be easy to fit, I think, into a sort of thoroughly instrumentalized training program.
Yeah, I guess we've always been interested in the idea that particularly through arts education, you're not necessarily just teaching someone a skill. Like, you're not just learning how to, as you say, learning how to write, or like learning how to draw, or learning how to sculpt or whatever, but you're teaching people how to think through the active decision making that is entailed in those activities. So, even if you were teaching to some extent, like we have lots of our tenants here, so we run a workspace, and we have tenants, a lot of whom come from the Building Crafts College in Stratford, which teaches, very kind of skill-based activities, teaches woodwork and stonemasonry. But, I think even in those kind of very skill-based practices, there is still this idea of, like, by teaching someone a skill, teaching someone how to engage with something, you're allowing them to make decisions for themselves. And that skill is something that can kind of be applied out in the world. And yet, I guess, you could also argue that with a skills-based college, that's also, to a certain extent, the directive, sending somebody towards a trade. But I guess maybe this is straying into a slightly different thing, which is something that I think is a real kind of contemporary problem, which is a kind of slightly different one to the humanities problem, which is that kind of lack of care for physical or technical education. So at the same time as, like, wanting to instrumentalize universities, not creating space for people to learn skill or applied practice. So it's kind of, I think it's almost like sort of contemporary universities seem to be wanting to create a kind of small amount of middle space, which is neither the space of kind of practical applicational thinking, nor is it a space of, I guess what you're saying, the kind of writing is also that thing, but it's just a slightly different craft. And yeah, quite what it is that the contemporary university is trying to create is perhaps then, I mean, who knows? Well, what is it trying to make? Who are these people?
No, I think, my own view is, in the present situation, one of the most important legacies that has been, in a sense, lost and should be thought about again is that of the old polytechnics. I could never understand why every single polytechnic in the country queued up to call itself a university. I mean, would you like to be the Polytechnic of Central London, or would you like to be the University of Westminster? I mean, would you like to be Lanchester Polytechnic, which had this great sort of tradition of connection with all sorts of industries in Coventry, or would you like to be Coventry University? It struck me as curious that they were all forced into this convergence with the notion of what a university was, led by governments and politicians, and that they then find themselves in a position where they're competing on the same terms to sort of all do more or less the same thing. So at that point, all those managerial skills or techniques, perhaps I should say, entered and became sort of directive. And, you know, the sort of intelligence of the university often became kind of almost proletarianized. You know, I mean, to be a professor at a university now is not to be making the decisions about the direction of anything. You know, you're maybe making the decisions about how the exam board runs or things like that, but you're not sitting there saying, well, you know, what should education be? What should this university be? And there's a whole structure of management that has been invented entirely to prevent that illusion from surviving. You know, so I mean, I think the focus on the technical, on the practical, is completely desirable. And I think, you know, this is why I'm saying I'm not thinking that we should simply try and go back to the old form of humanities education and the associated attitudes. I think they're genuinely useless. And part of the problem we have now is that a small number of people is trying to reinstate them, which is why, you know, the idea of media studies as a permanent joke continues, although how you live in a world saturated with media without at least some people developing a critical understanding of how they work seems to me an astonishing thought, you know. So that would be my feeling, is that we've got to, I mean, connectedness is a very good idea. Forms of thought that one can develop in the humanities are absolutely to be understood in their applicability and their range and how they would operate in a contemporary reality, indeed, including an economic one. And I think that those forms of practical familiarity of the hand, the craft, the making, I mean, obviously crucial as well. So the problem we've got at the moment is the university is moving away from all of those, and where it wants them within a particular framework which disconnects them from the whole that we're discussing.
And what about organization? I mean, you know, it feels like one of the, again, a kind of slightly different problem, or the interrelated problem, is that the universities become more centralized. They've become more kind of autocratic, and there is less a sense, I guess, the thing you were just talking about the kind of professor being able to make decisions or being able to have agency. But I guess, is there a sense in which, I'm thinking of some of the schools that popped up in London, particularly art schools that popped up in London over the last kind of 10 years, these kind of like alternative courses where people were trying to self-organize or create different modes of education, where people were, saying, rejecting the masters of fine art or whatever, and saying, instead, we're going to create our own course by doing things with each other. Is there a kind of opportunity to say, actually, maybe we don't need these kind of very centralized institutions telling everybody, this is how education should be, but perhaps more distributed frameworks, if that's a kind of jargonistic way of describing it.
And also where the motivation comes from somewhere close to the student, rather than the director or the vice chancellor or indeed the academic staff. I mean, I had a very interesting time with a project like this, and I like to think of it as a project, not an institution. I mean, the institution always brings the death with it. If you set up institutions, you end up struggling your whole life to pay for the buildings, that kind of stuff, even if your buildings are virtuous and good. But I mean, what we had, the London Consortium, was a project. We were set up in the wake of the sort of 60s, 70s, but much later. And it was academically validated and run through Birkbeck, but it was owned by the Tate, by the Science Museum. The BFI was involved for a bit. The Institute of Contemporary Arts were involved for a bit. It always had 4 or 5 bodies owning it. And what happened was that students came and they did Masters of MRes. We had a Masters of Residence or whatever. I didn't know what it meant. And then we did do doctorates. But people would come, and it was fully international. The fees were paid, but they were quite cheap because the costs were kept low. And we did things as we wanted to. We had courses in which there are always 2 teachers in the room. You would never get a university to do that because it doesn't fit the costings. We had courses which were 4 weeks long and full time. There were six or 7 or 8 hours a week of contact time. We didn't use that language, and it was a delightful thing to be involved in. And it went bust, of course, partly because the universities reconfigured around it, and they all started doing, partnership PhDs, and everyone was being encouraged to go and find exterior organisations. But I didn't mind that it came to an end. It was sad for some of the people who weren't finished. But basically, I think things don't have to last forever. I think the power of intelligence is with projects, not with institutions. And projects should end. They should come to an end. And it should be sad if they've been any good. But they shouldn't. Nothing deserves to be totally set in sort of eternal concrete because it exists. So I think, this is exactly the sort of thing that I think we need to look for, is examples of people finding us an area of interest which they need to know more about, want to know more about, and, doing stuff. And I mean, if big institutions can be involved in making that work, so be it. But if big institutions only see it as a way of colonizing and dominating a field or developing a new program, we called our courses as well. This language of modules, and this is another thing that sort of this present sort of regime in the universities seems to be. Everything is taken away from the kind of heart of what the project should be about.
Sorry, I just had to shut the door. Okay. It's swung open of its own accord. But yeah, I mean, I think it is nice to talk about, looking for new things and starting new things and not kind of trying always to refresh or to reform the old things. Because sometimes, I mean, I found this in some institutions, there's a kind of weight of history and it becomes very sticky and very treacly, and you're kind of like trying to kind of shift something or change a direction, or a new person comes in and tries to do something and makes a lot of effort, but there's so much institutional resistance to anything, and so sometimes it does feel like maybe the really exciting things are happening elsewhere, where people are just sort of saying, okay, well, let's start something new. Let's not.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, one of the things that really shocked me when I got into the sort of the normal university world was how impossibly difficult it is to change anything. I mean, at the London Consortium, we had a rule that these courses we did would always be cut after 3 years. We'd run them 3 times and then we'd cancel them when we come up with a new set of courses. The view was that you can do a course on anything. So why always do it on the same stuff? And if it's successful, why keep it? Why not do another thing successfully? Make a new set of connections and find a new set of curiosities. But in the universities, there is a kind of bureaucratic ossification, which means, the validation process for a new course takes about 2 years to get through. You could do it in a week in a normal circumstance. I mean, you should just think, it'd be interesting to talk about this, let's do it. But no, you go through this enormously elaborate process. Reading lists are equally stuck up to their waist in mud. I mean, I remember when I went to King's, I was given a course that needed to be taught, and which was a very good course called Modernity in the City. But, this was in 2020 or maybe a bit earlier, not much earlier. And the reading list was all books that had been written in the 80s, because that's how, that was the reading list, and people had added a bit and taken a bit off. But the core of it was this unrevised thing which had been validated once, and it had never been worth anybody's time to go through the procedures of starting again with it. So I think the flexibility is also what is missing. Once you get into this sort of degree mill process, which is managed through this sort of vast thing, which seems to me to be more like a personnel department than an institute of learning. It's got codifications and rules and procedures. Once that becomes the main reality, and students get so frightened as the debts mount up. I mean, why wouldn't they? They're paying all this money and they don't know where they're going. So of course their anxiety levels are soaring, and so they get troubled about all this stuff. So I think that seems to me to be the lock that one has to sort of try and find a way around. And I mean, it's sort of ironic in a way, because the other thing I noticed in universities is that, it may just be me, I don't think it is. People don't talk about they don't read each other's research even. Do you know, I mean, there's a situation where, there should be a conversation. We said, look, this person's done all this work. Let's hear about it. Let's figure out what this is and let's see what we make of it. But it's so rare for that to happen. I mean, what they do is they count each other's research. They figure out whether it qualifies for the ref or whatever it's called, but they don't actually engage with it in any other way. So, and I'm not blaming individuals here, because I think this is the pressure that people are working under now. But it's really damaging, and I think it's completely right to be looking for ways of sort of starting afresh in a more temporary and makeshift. We started off by talking about makeshift bungalettes. Maybe we want a bungalette version of a university. If you like, I could show you some pictures. Or you've just been to Sheppey.
Yeah, that sounds nice. I mean, I think the only concern I have, I've seen people kind of set up some alternatives, and one of the things that kind of struck me about, certainly when an alternative offer is new, is that it can be inaccessible insofar as, it takes a certain kind of person or a certain kind of security and privilege to be able to say, actually, I'm not going to do that thing, which I know, leads to these kinds of worlds. I'm going to, look to this alternative way of learning and being. And I think this is one of the things, I guess, which is maybe a problem, particularly for my generation, is a kind of, because there's so much kind of financial insecurity, you feel like maybe the chance to make mistakes or to do things that don't have, or don't have like an end to them, it isn't really there, or it's only there for some privileged people.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think that's a real struggle that I think we have with young students, is that they're like, maybe that's not an option for me. I can't do the alternative. And I think, that's a real issue, because it's like, we can't just, allow for the alternative to kind of create itself and trust that will in itself be accessible and inclusive, and, everyone will be able to, get on board with that. And I think, that's sort of something that really concerns me.
I think you're so right. I mean, I keep trying not to go back to the past, but my experience of the 70s was that in 1974, having done a degree at Kent, I got on a plane and went and lived in Vancouver, and I was there 5 years, and all I came back with was an MA. I did a 5-year MA, moving between universities. And the reason I was there was because they had these things called teaching assistantships, which paid just about exactly the same as I was getting as a full-time supply teacher in Canterbury, or in Whitstable as it was there when I was working. But what I'm saying is that it was possible to live just about. I mean, it was completely marginal. There was never enough money. You were always stuck for where your next whatever it was going to come from. But for that period of time, I was reading and thinking and talking, and I look back on it it was chaotic. It was a period of great terror, because I had no idea. I didn't want to stay in Canada. I had no idea how I was going to resolve the future. But what I was able to do was to get a perspective together. And I think so for me, that was a period of privilege that I experienced as kind of extreme difficulty. But I knew all the time that it was what I needed to do. But in a way, what I was doing was using the university and its culture without paying too much regard for the career path.
Yeah.
And it was partly because, I knew that as long as I had a teaching assistantship, my visa could be renewed and I wouldn't have to go through the hassle of sorting that problem out. But I think what I draw from that is maybe the sense that, how much can you reasonably expect a sort of higher education system to look after your requirements? I mean, what it'll do if you enter it, it'll put you through this funnel. It'll leave you indebted. It will bore you as well as interest you. It will depress you as well as sometimes excite you. And then you'll come out and you'll be what you went in with. You'll be in a situation where you've got a big debt, vast financial trepidations facing you, which they never did for us, because in my generation, there were areas that were ironed out. If you moved to part of London where housing was cheap because nobody wanted to live there, you ended up as I did in Dalston. Now, anyone who bought a house in Dalston when I was there is going to have a smile forever, but it's going to be a smile at other people's cost, So, but what I'm saying is, I think the question really is whether one can place this sort of type of thought and investigation into people's lives without necessarily pretending you're answering all their problems and taking the weight of that on. You and your generation have got to kind of get by. You've got to work out how to make this system, how to survive in this crazy system we've grown up around us. Now, the sort of initiative we're talking about might help you understand that. It might help you sort of find other people who are thinking about it. It might help you sort of develop a perspective about it. But it wouldn't help you solve the problem of your living. It's not going to give you the piece of paper that 1 out of 10 people with it can turn into a job that has a half reasonable quality to it. But I mean, I still think it's worth doing, and I still think it's a better place to start. And I'm troubled by the extent to which these sort of DIY, sort of half institution, half movement, half just bad-tempered quarrel, these initiatives, which is what all these places are like, the ones I've ever seen, they've all got that shambolic quality about them, but they are sort of crucibles of interest and thought. And it seems to me that these have gone. I mean, I just don't see, I mean, I like to think that the young must be doing it in their own ways in various places that I don't hear about. But you don't get a sense that that is happening. And I think that has to be regenerated. And I think regenerating that is not the same as trying to produce another degree program. I don't see how it can be, I mean, but I think it is very, very key to do it. And, I think the exchange of ideas and experience, which could cross generational lines quite a lot in these circumstances, would also be interesting to have happening. So we're talking about sort of enriching activity that enriches rather than a different sort of institution, I think.
Yeah, I guess for us, and I guess talking about my own experience, for us, the way that we did that was that we made a practice, which is also a business, a way of us making money. But I think primarily, when we started it, we were doing it as an amateur activity on the side in our evenings and weekends. And it was a way of, and it continues to be a way of us learning from each other. So, there are 14 of us, as kind of members of this collective, and we all use what we do as a way of kind of nourishing each other and providing each other with kind of new references and ways of thinking and doing things. And, we're all learning different things at the same time. And I think, we've found that that's easier to do possibly within our own practice than it is within the framework of an institution, even within the framework of teaching roles, which we've also taken on.
But when you take on teaching roles, do you teach as your own organisation, or do you mean individually you go off and get a job at the Bartlett or whatever? Do you know?
A bit of, it's more the individual.
Yeah.
Very hard to
yeah, of course it is, yeah.
Within the framework of a normal institution.
Yeah, and it may not be a weight you can bear. I mean, it may be these structures need to be quite light and quite flexible, and having a sort of a timetable, a university type timetable, even only in a part of you, is going to be difficult to configure around. I mean, these are all difficult questions, but I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I look at, I've been publishing books with this young company called Repeater, which is another example. I mean, it feels to me that every time I talk to anybody involved in it, that I always imagine them living in some sort of shed on the Cornish coast. I mean, it's all fully digital, it's all decentralized, and it's fearless. That's what I love about it. These are, and I keep saying to myself, God, when they've lived as long as I have, they'll know that. And they'll know how heroic they are, because basically being able to sort of run a list of publications and have conversations and participate in events, and I mean, these are really valuable initiatives which could easily kind of extend into forms of learning in different ways. So I think you're right, but I just don't know where the university sits in all this. I mean, because the university, faced with a project like you've described, would just pick a few of you off. And, then you'd end up doing a bit of teaching, and then if it worked, they'd want more of it. And, then you'd end up with a kind of an imbalance within the network, possibly, because there'll be other people who are just doing the work. And, I mean, it's interesting. But what I also like about your initiative is you've got this, this sort of intellectual discussion going on, as well as this practical work, but also you're doing it by working very close to the community, so-called, or to particular communities. So you're not going out there in the mode of the, wannabe Lord Foster, big fuck you, computer-aided design masterpieces. You're not an architect of that sort of tool. You're working into, social situations which are quite tight, quite modest often. And you're housing people who aren't millionaires, so this is all very interesting.
And I guess in a way that's the educational project that we're interested in, which is the one where we open ourselves up to learning from the world, where you spend time in places and learn from that experience and learn from other people's experience, and spend time with people learning from them. And I guess, I guess it's sort of leading towards saying, like, actually, it's finding ways of encouraging people to do that, to find ways that they can then both sustain themselves as young people in the world, but also that where they can create space for ongoing learning and kind of mutual learning with their peers and with, communities with people in the world. It sounds great and very easy, but I'm sure. How do you support that? How do you kind of foster that kind of thing? In a way, maybe that's what, I guess that is the role of education, right? That's the role of education, is to encourage those things to happen, encourage people to kind of believe that they can do those sorts of things.
Yeah, and to create places where people can almost be autonomous and yet self-educating, self-raising, and I think that's just terrific. And I learned that I was teaching at King's, but I was down in Sheerness dealing with this high German writer, Uwe Johnson, who lived there for 10 years and wrote all these descriptions in letters to people like Hannah Arendt, for goodness sake. And I had to sort of try and figure out what this story was. And I went down to Sheerness and they took one look at me and they smiled and said, okay, we know you don't come from around here and we think we know who you are, really, even though we've never talked to you. And let's be silent. It's Sheerness, the kind of town where if you take out a camera on the high street, it's a Georgian town, right? It's not very big, but it is a Georgian town. You take out a camera on the high street, and a young mother with a guy, I did this only, sort of a few years ago, few young mothers with kids in prams and things on the pavement. One of them came and looked up at me as I walked off, and then I'd taken a picture of a building and just said, "Are you from the council then?" And I thought that, this is a community where you don't go to take pictures for any other reason that you're monitoring something or keeping an eye on some transgression or something, But what I found was I sort of couldn't get anywhere. I couldn't get the town to open up to me at all. I wanted to talk to people who were going to be open to me about what this place was and what the history was since the 60s, when the dockyard closed and the economy was trashed and the whole place was just abandoned to its own sort of self and a few sociologists. And eventually what happened was I found a community arts organization. We got these translations done of these Johnson texts, quite short paragraphs often. And we put together a group of people. And they were really local people. They were like the people who were being described in these texts we had. They all volunteered. We met in this little cottage that's sort of a semi-heritage place. And we spent a winter meeting every week and reading them and talking about them. And then they sort of assembled a desire to do a performance. And we ended up in the local theatre and we did this performance. And all this information started coming out in this process, And for them, I think it was a nice, pleasant thing to do. I think it was agreeable and interesting, and they found out they enjoyed one another, if not me. They certainly found out about this curious German writer who had lived in their midst and died in their midst. But what was terrific for me was that it was just an example. If you just work with books, you're stuffed, You'll get all these weird ideas. You'll end up talking about Sheerness like everybody always does, describing it as a dump. Well, obviously, it doesn't help. We all know that. It's a place which has been abandoned. But there are people living there, and they're trying to get things to happen. So there is all this wonderful energy. And Johnson loved that, I picked up on another generation's worth of it. But it was very good for me to sort of go through that experience. I couldn't have written the book I wrote without it. But the key thing for me was, if you don't find yourself in a relationship with, people who are not of the sort of the university types you were describing earlier, then you're going to be trapped in this little bubble of your own. And however elaborate your thinking, however much time you spent into working out what your ideas of structure or process or system are, you're nothing really if you don't exist in that wider world. I mean, I really think that's true. And that's the legacy of the sort of tradition of social thought that I've been associated with, which has been defeated in many of its plans and its prognostications, but is completely correct in that idea that your role is to understand that, you know, you've had the advantages of your situation, however mixed they've been, and now you've got to find some way of taking that into a wider communication. And I think that's, to me, what an educational role should be. And it's always two ways. You know, I mean, you're learning as much as anybody else is. So I feel that those are like projects. You know, that's not, I mean, I dressed it up as research when the university asked me to do it, but it was a project and it was about encounters and, you know, you were reflecting about yourself as well as other people. And, you know, I mean, that seems to me to be what we don't have very much anymore in this present system.
Yeah, certainly not within the university.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, something that we've seen a lot with kind of architecture courses is the desire to sort of falsify that, or like to sort of create an academic kind of simulacra,
a version of it, yeah,
of that kind of interaction, of that kind of project, and it always sort of tastes a bit funny, you know. It's like,
well, yeah, you see that even in Sheerness, you see people are used to that process. They're used to these sort of these characters arriving and saying, now we're going to do this, now we're going to do that. But that sort of open-ended, well, this could go anywhere and we don't have to do anything with it anyway. If it doesn't work, we'll stop, was what made this one more interesting, I think. But you're quite right. I mean, I think these processes are what we're after. They have to be, I think. I mean, that said, it is good to have an understanding of the system we're in. And you don't get that out of local experience always. You need people to bring other perspectives into play. But so I think, you know, I think there's no question the role for a kind of critical reflection and a sort of critical archaeology of our times, if you like, is absolutely central. And I mean, some of it will continue to go on in universities, but my hope will be that the people in universities will find, people who are doing it in universities will find themselves more inclined to come out into these other types of initiatives as much as they can, because it's not going to happen otherwise. You know, we're going to have, certainly in the humanities, we're going to be confined, and the sort of the wreckage of the art schools is terrible, really. I mean, the sort of consolidation of education in that field is really quite alarming, I think. I mean, the loss too to the culture, because they were sort of fairly anarchistic and wild places, but they were incredibly, well, I don't have to tell you this, they were hugely influential as well, and generated, I mean, you know, we now live in this world of the creative industries. Well, you know, I mean, we didn't always talk like that, because I think we learned to talk like that under Thatcher in a way that you couldn't hope to, any justification for the arts would stand up unless it had money attached to it. So you had to, in a sense. But it is also true that, you know, creative quarters have worked, and, you know, this is something that we've got on our side, I think, and will open increasingly as the future goes ahead, I hope.
I guess we haven't really spoken about it, and maybe it's kind of another conversation, but it sort of starts much earlier. It's like the marginalization of the arts and humanities and kind of critical reflection at a very early stage of our education. You know,
yeah, that's entirely true.
It's been kind of, you know, within the, you know, primary school curriculum, like those things are increasingly marginalized and considered to be, you know, inessential. And it feels like, as a result, you know, the kind of impact is felt throughout the kind of system, but it's not just, you know, the university sector, but it's throughout our education, throughout, you know, the way that we approach knowledge and our relationship to it throughout our lives. But yeah, I think for us, we've always been particularly interested in the way that young people learn and particularly through play. But you know, that feels like it's a really, yeah, it's there has been an assault across the system. And I think, that it's sort of almost easier when people have from a young age kind of understood that things like artistic practice have no place in kind of their everyday, to kind of then marginalize it later on, and to not, to get rid of things like art foundation courses and so on.
Yeah. And this applies to music education as well. I mean, one of the great achievements in that field, I'm talking about classical music, and well, not only, but, orchestral music, is that the experience that many people working in that field, there's a woman called Gillian Moore who used to do stuff at the South Bank Centre in London, but there's the Northern Symphonia story in Newcastle. There are lots of examples of this where it's the educational program that deals with the avant-garde stuff. You would expect it to be the educational program that deals with the easy stuff, and that's what music education was first thought of. But the development of all this, the consequence of all this work that's been done over several decades now, is that if you want to take an experimental, innovative piece of music forward, you give it to the education department, because kids don't have those prejudices. They're not sitting there waiting for the Beethoven tune or whatever it is. I mean, I'm talking in the classical language now, but that I think is also very impressive, that the amount that has been done that has gone so well, that is now threatened, is deplorable. And we should hold on to what's been demonstrated in that, which is that basically you can do all sorts of crazy things with a school curriculum and limit it to this sort of instrumentalized bunch of contents and tricks, as if really what we're dealing with is not in the schools the humanities, but a kind of enough Shakespeare to pass a citizenship test. There's nothing about it to enable you to sort of think through your situation or to understand the way people react in different ways, which is of course what people always used to say was great about the novel in the earlier parts of the 20th century. But so basically what I think we have to do is to get those points of access that you've described. And it seems to me the young folks, school kids, is a good place to be.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the place to start.